What's up, snappers? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to a brand new season of Marvel Snap, The Dark Avengers. Today we're going to be looking at the brand new card, Victoria Hand, to see if she's worth your precious resources. We're going to be looking at key Synergies Counters and some decks that I brewed for her. But wait, before we do that, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel. I do weekly reviews of the brand new card in Marvel Snap, so if you don't want to miss out, hit that notification bell right now. Now let's get back into it. Now the question is, who is Victoria Hand? Let's take a look. So Victoria Hand in Marvel Snap is a 2-cost, 3-powered card with the ability of ongoing. Your cards that were created in your hand have +2 power. So I believe her ability is very good for cards that have been created, especially when you play them on the board. You get that +2 power for free, technically, because she's an ongoing card. She has the potential to revive older decks, especially maybe some Devil Dino decks or some Coulson decks. I believe she has a lot of potential to maybe carve her way in the meta. All right, now let's take a look at some of the pros and cons about Victoria Hand. Let's take a look. So she affects multiple cards. The cards that have been played on the board, that +2 power is pretty strong. We already know +3 is pretty strong, but +2 is definitely very, very good as well. Low cost ongoing. She's only a 2-cost card, right? Especially just being able to play her on the board on curve, you know, reap all the benefits from all the created cards. I believe that 2 cost is definitely a very strong case for her being viable in this meta. So any card generated or created in your hand brings her more value. So you definitely want to run cards that create more cards, and you definitely will bring up her value tremendously. So she has the potential to make card generation decks viable. Decks like maybe Devil Dino, Agent Coulson, maybe even Arishand. So yeah, there's definitely potential in her making certain decks even better. So now let's talk about the cons about Victoria Hand. She could be countered easily, especially being played on curve. She's going to be a welcome sign for counters because, you know, people are going to be aiming towards her because she affects multiple cards. She's definitely going to be target number 1 so you get countered. So she's also dependent on card generation cards, what you generate in your hand, especially if you are dealing with a lot of random chaos with your hand generating cards, not knowing what you're running. That could definitely create an element of RNG for you, and it could potentially, you know, ruin your games. So you are very reliant on the cards that you're generating for this deck. So another big con about her is that you need the energy to play these created cards, right? You definitely need to think about that when you're deck building. You need to make sure, oh, can I play these card generation cards? You definitely want to make sure you have enough energy, or maybe some max energy, or maybe ramp out energy. You definitely need a lot of energy to play these generated cards. Another thing you have to look out for is that you have to watch your hand size, especially when you're creating a lot of cards in your hand. You definitely want to be careful of what you're creating, and you have to manage your hand size, right? You definitely don't want to fill up your hand, lose a draw of your deck. Yeah, that'll be very, very tough. So definitely be careful of your hand size. All right, now let's take a look at some of the key synergies and counters for Victoria Hand. Let's take a look. So the first synergy that I want to talk about is Agent Coulson. Again, he's just an example of a card generation. He loves 4 and 5 cost cards, so he's going to synergize very well with Victoria Hand. You can definitely play those cards on curve, especially her being a 2-cost, him a 3-cost, and then again, you're going to have a lot of good curving energy with that deck. Another synergy is Quinjet. You definitely want to discount your cards. Whatever you're generating with a deck with Victoria Hand, you definitely want to discount those cards. So Quinjet is essential with Victoria Hand. So another synergy is Moon Girl. She is duplicating your hand, which is technically, you know, creating cards in your hand. So any of those cards that you've created, you definitely could play them on the board and they will count for Victoria Hand. So now let's talk about the counters. Red Guardian, of course, is a great counter against Victoria Hand, disabling that ongoing effect. So she's technically just a 2/3, which is very, very tough. So since Victoria Hand is an ongoing card, Enchantress is a great counter against Victoria Hand. I know a lot of people don't play Enchantress, but she's a great counter against ongoing cards, so definitely play her. Another counter that I want to talk about is Master Mold. Master Mold can ruin your hand size, especially if you're generating a lot of cards in your hand. You definitely need that space. So if you get Master Mold, then that definitely could clog up your hand, which is very, very scary. All right, now let's take a look at some of the decks that I brewed. I think they're pretty fun and competitive. Let's take a look. So the first deck that I have is called Double Up My Hand. So the ideal goal of this deck is to double up whatever's in your hand and then flood the board near the end of the turns and just reap all the power that you're generating. So for turn 1, Sunspot is a great on curve option, especially if you're floating energy at times. So it's totally okay to run Sunspot on curve, especially you might be floating energy at times with this deck. Rocket Raccoon, you probably want to save for the later turns, but you could technically run them on curve, especially if you're feeling, you know, lucky. King H3 is another option to play on curve, especially if you have Thor or Beta Ray Bill in your hand. Hydra Bob is another good option if you want to double up the card with Moon Girl, or definitely flood lanes at the end of the turn with Hydra Bob. So for turn 2, Armor is good to protect cards like Hit Monkey, Thor, Beta Ray Bill, She-Hulk, all the big cards you definitely want to protect Armor. Black Swan is a good option to play on curve, especially activating her on turn 5 is amazing with all these 1-cost cards. You definitely want to set up her for that. Victoria Hand should be played on curve, or you can double her up with Moon Girl. Hit Monkey, you definitely should save for the end turns, but you can also double him up with Moon Girl. On turn 3, Thor should be played, especially starting to generate that hammer, and you can use even King E30 to get his hammer back. Moon Girl is definitely clutch in this list, especially if you have any of the hammers in your hand or any of the 1-cost cards in your hand. You definitely want to double up those cards with Moon Girl. Beta Ray Bill, again, is just another example of Thor. It's the same use case, it's just more power, but definitely the same principle with Beta Ray Bill. She-Hulk is awesome to double up, especially with Moon Girl or floating energy at certain times. Maybe turn 5, you float with her. She becomes a 1-cost, which is crazy. All right, so now let's look at my second list. So this list is called Arishand. It's a play on Arisham, of course. So the ideal goal of this deck is to generate cards, use that max energy from Arisham, and counter your opponent. So for turn 1, Quinjet should be played on curve, especially discounting all the cards that you're gonna be generating with this hand. So for turn 2, Loki's totally fine. It really depends on the matchup that you're facing. If you're facing against discard, then you probably want to avoid using Loki, but in normal cases, Loki is fine in Arisham. So the Collector has great value in this list, especially when you're running Agent Coulson, Nick Fury. It definitely generates some power for him. Victoria Hand gets benefit from this list if you're generating cards with Agent Coulson, Nick Fury. I know her ability doesn't count with Arisham, but she gets value of the cards that are being generated in your hand. Rogue, you definitely want to save for the later turns, countering their big ongoing power. You definitely want to use Rogue there. Agent Coulson has synergy with Victoria Hand and the Collectors, so you can definitely play him on turn 3. Shang-Chi, definitely want to save him for the later turns as a great counter to a lot of power decks. Nick Fury brings value to this list, creating those cards, and then they get benefit with Victoria Hand and the max energy from Arisham. Blob brings that big power that you might need in this list. Alioth is a nasty finisher, especially if you're trying to protect your big cards like Blob. You definitely want to run Alioth right after Blob. Mockingbird gets tons of value here, especially the cards that have been generated from Arisham, Agent Coulson, Nick Fury, or even Loki. And you're probably not going to be playing Arisham. All right, let's look at my third and final list. So this list is called Max Energy Hand. So the ideal goal of this list is to play on curve, make sure you're playing on curve, and then taking advantage of all the max energy that you're gonna be creating with this list. So for turn 1, of course, you can run Quicksilver or Hydra Bob. Mirage, Hawkeye, Valentina, or Victoria Hand are options on turn 2. Hawkeye, K Bishop creates arrows, so technically they work with Victoria Hand, getting those buffs. So for Mirage, I believe that it should work with Victoria Hand. Copying a card, let's hope it works with Victoria Hand. So for Valentina, you are creating a random 6-cost card, so it should work with Victoria Hand. Rocket Raccoon and Groot is my spicy pick in this deck. I know it's a brand new card. It could be played on curve, and the utility of this card is very, very nice. Speed fits well on this list, especially if when you're playing on curve, you definitely want to run Speed either on curve, or you can play him on turn 6. Copycat has returned to the meta. I believe she brings a lot of good value and great intel about what your opponent's playing. Galacta is just awesome. Her amount of power that she generates, that +3, is insane. Playing her on curve is great. Wiccan, you definitely want to make sure you're playing on curve to get his on reveal popping off. That 2+ max energy is so good. So definitely you can play on curve with this list. I believe there's a lot of low costs, so you can definitely play on curve before you play Wiccan. Alioth is just a nasty finisher. You could potentially play him on turn 5 or even earlier, depending on the matchup, but Alioth is a nasty finisher on turn 6. Now let's take a look at the spotlights that are featured with Victoria Hand. Let's take a look. So Victoria Hand is paired up with Grandmaster and Hawkeye Kate Bishop. Victoria Hand is a Series 5 card, Grandmaster is a Series 4 card, and Kate Bishop is Series 4. So if you like to have fun in Marvel Snap, I would say Grandmaster is a great pickup, but I would say unfortunately he's kind of niche, so you could definitely be passed in a lot of situations. Hawkeye Kate Bishop, definitely one of the best season pass cards that we ever had in Marvel Snap. So for the Spotlight variants, Victoria Hand and Hawkeye Kate Bishop, I would say they're definitely passable. I'm not really in love with them, but again, art is subjective. Grandmaster looks awesome. I think it's definitely worth picking up. I love the colors. I love the pose. But remember, guys, make sure you have 4 keys before opening in a week. You definitely don't want to regret missing out a card or a variant that you really want. So be careful with your keys. Now let's take a look at my star ratings for Victoria Hand. Let's take a look. So for competitive, I gave her a 2.5 stars. I believe that she has the potential to revitalize some of these old archetypes in Marvel Snap, but I'm a little bit reserved on my rating because either depending on what you generated or what's on the board, it really determines her value in Marvel Snap. For fun, I gave her a 3 stars. I think it really depends if you like the card generation archetype, if you like, you know, the randomness of Arishand or Coulson, for example. I think that could bring a lot of joy to some people, but if you're not a fan, then, you know, I give it a safe 3 stars. For flexibility, I gave it a 1 star. I think eventually people will find what's the best deck for her, but really, again, just like I mentioned, card generation decks are pretty much her go-to. So for future changes, I gave her 2.5 stars. I don't really see her potentially getting nerfed, but maybe she'll get buffed in the future. I think her power maybe is a little bit low. I'll say she's a pretty safe card to potentially not get changed much in Marvel Snap. All right, so now let's take a look at my final review of Victoria Hand. Is she worth a snap or skip? Let's take a look. So I say snap on Victoria Hand. I know it's a little bit of a surprise based on my star ratings, but I believe that she has a lot of potential to help out some of the archetypes that I mentioned. I can see her potentially being a meta card, especially if Arishand pops off again, or card generation decks like maybe with Loki. She definitely has purpose with her +2 power. I think people might be sleeping on it, but yeah, her ability is pretty good. So let me know your thoughts on Victoria Hand. What do you think about her? What do you think are some synergies or some decks that I missed out on? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to grow out this amazing community and I would love for you to be a part of it. And Happy New Year. I really appreciate you being here, watching my videos and supporting the channel. It really means the world to me. And I'll see you guys on the next Snap or Skip. Happy snapping.